Welcome everyone to OPA Live. And before we get into the heart of the matter and these important transit, I just want to insert a quick word about our retreat next year in Zion National Park in Utah. So the wonderful thing about this retreat is that it's an educational event, two parts. Part one in April from the 23rd to the 26th, and part two from the 27th to the 29th. And the wonderful thing is that you're not just with a great community and great speaker, but you can also explore the outdoors. We're going to have night sky exploration, and Utah, has amazing skies. So part one consists basically of selecting a track, and you spend 3 days with your mentor. So you have a selection of 13 tracks from wonderful speakers, completely different types of astrology. You have a horary track, and you have declination, and you have karmic astrology, you have beginners, you have health, relationships. So for 3 days, you're basically immersed in that in-depth study. And along with the track, you also have two sections. One of them is the theme of the retreat, which is bridging science and spirituality. So we're going to have a full day just talking about that. And that's all, the whole audience together. And the second panel we have is about addressing arguments against astrology. All these things that come up about what is the 13th sign, and why are the constellation not the same size as the signs? Why is there such an aversion in the religious world against astrology? So we're going to talk about all these different aspects of what the prejudices and the argument made, so that we can be better informed and address these arguments for ourselves and for the wider public. So I invite you to look at the OPA website, opaastrology.org, and I hope to see you next year in Utah in this amazing retreat. Now, when you select the prices, just one more note, you will see the regular price for the retreat, and then there's a price for the meal that's already included. So it may look like it's higher than what's listed. It's because the meals are included, and we really want to create a community experience where we dine, we have lunch together, and we connect. Because part of OPA is definitely about the community aspect. So enough of the retreat. Now we are going to introduce our speakers and talk about OPA Live. And the dramatic transits ahead. Some of you may have seen on the Facebook page that we posted some chart of what's going on right now. We're going to start with Nadiya speaking about Mars entering, being in Cancer and conjuncting the North Node, and then opposing Pluto Saturn. And we're going to continue with April, who is going to address the eclipses coming up in July. So the eclipses are also in Cancer Capricorn, with the solar eclipse, I believe, on the 2nd, and the lunar eclipse on the 16th of July. Then Margaret is going to speak specifically about the Pluto-Saturn cycle and leading to the conjunction in January 2020. And so we see that a lot of the activities are actually happening on the Cancer-Capricorn axis. But then Kim Marie will complete our presentation here with addressing the Neptune square Jupiter cycle. So they have been in an on and off square for the past few months. And In June, they are actually locking on the 18th degree of Pisces and Sagittarius. And what's really so fascinating about this square is that both Jupiter and Neptune are in their own sign. So Jupiter is at its strongest in Sagittarius, Neptune at its strongest in Pisces. And they're both co-rulers of Pisces. And now you will notice in this chart that there are so many planets at 18 degrees. Neptune 18, Mars 18, Saturn 18, Jupiter 18, and even that day the moon is at 18. And something similar happens tomorrow, just on a side note. We have a grand cross at 18 degrees mutable with the sun opposing Jupiter, which means Jupiter is the closest to the Earth that it will be in its cycle. And there's a report, I haven't been able to confirm that because it has been a bit overcast here, that you can actually, if you have clear skies, you can look at Jupiter around 9 p.m. in the beautiful constellation of Scorpio. With binoculars, you may actually be able to see the moons of Jupiter. So when when any planet opposes the sun, it's very close to the Earth, and we have that opportunity. So we have so much to cover, and we're going to start with Nadia. Let me exit my slides and stop sharing. Nadia, let me unmute you. Let's see.
Unmute me. Hi, everybody. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you for this opportunity. The amazing speakers who are here on the panel. Very grateful to be here. So let me just pull up my presentation as well.
Well, let me introduce you. Nadia is currently living in Mexico, originally living in Canada, and has a really wonderful YouTube channel with many, many, many followers from all over the world. And Nadia has presented for OPA previously, speaking actually about how we can use social media to sustain ourselves as astrologers. So she gave a talk about the profession of astrology, and people were really fascinated because we live definitely in those times where we can reach really wide audience if we do it wisely, and Nadia has a special gift.
Thanks.
So thank you. I'm going to mute myself. I see I have an echo here. And let's begin with Mars on the North Node in Cancer.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maurice. Thank you to the amazing panel that I am so privileged and grateful to be a part of, and all the people here who are OPA members and who are part of this moment. If you know anything about my work or me, or if you've ever met me at a conference or anything, you know, I always start with, hello, fabulous OPA. So we are going to start there with a nice sort of encouraging Greek sentiment, a little bit of a Greek sentiment, right? I'm not Greek, but I'm just saying, I just thought of that with OPA. But again, really, really grateful to be here. I hope that we all have a lot of fun, especially during my little 20-minute moment sharing with you. And so I am going to be speaking on Mars in Cancer, the North Node, and we'll be touching on a few other, as I am calling them here for the title, just to keep it interesting, wacky adventures in the collective unfolding of the universe. Now, a lot of the things I'm going to be talking about today, the different subjects, and I'll be talking about, let's see here, Jungian archetypes and planets, and I'll be talking about a few myths as well. A lot of what I will be discussing is actually based on articles that you can find on my website, nadiyashah.com. But here's what I'm going to be presenting in the moments that I have with you. A very quick recap of the North Node. I know that this is an organization of professional astrologers, so you may not need the recap, but I will breeze through that just for those who are a little bit newer. And a very quick recap of Pluto and Saturn. Again, I know that that's being presented later on in this afternoon, at least afternoon in the Americas. But I will touch on it very briefly because I think that it is relevant to the configuration that I'm going to be focusing more on, which is Mars and the North Node. So we'll be taking a Jungian perspective on Mars, exploring that a little bit, and Mercury actually. And I actually think that Mercury is going to be part of the saving grace of this time. Whereas Mars itself can be a pretty intense energy when you're right in it, and especially on the North Node, such a karmic symbol in the sky. It is ultimately going to be Mercury that is going to help us to elevate, to understand, and to use that energy that much more to our advantage, individually, certainly, but also as the collective as well. And as Maurice mentioned earlier, he shared this chart. He asked me to make sure to talk about this chart. So we are going to be talking about all these planets getting together at 18 degrees. So you will recognize that image if you're connected to OPA on Facebook, but we'll be looking at the larger configuration together and then touching on some of the challenges and the opportunities. And that is actually about what is happening beyond June. And I think that some of the great opportunities and possibilities of what transpires now is actually going to start revealing itself to us once we get into July, not just because of the eclipses, putting eclipses aside, because again, I know someone else is going to talk about that, but Venus is going to meet the North Node, and I think that's going to be a beautiful and big deal as well. So let's dive in here. I hope everyone's doing really, really well today, wherever you are on the beautiful planet. So what are the nodes of the moon? So essentially, again, I know that this is the Organization of Professional Astrologers, but a very quick recap for those who are a little bit newer.
Just a note, Nadia.
Yes, please.
You know, OPA is open to all level of expertise. So even though our focus is on elevating standards, for professional standards, our audience is really a wide spectrum of expertise. So don't worry about, you know, covering the basics. It's welcomed.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, so you're going to get basics then. What are the nodes of the moon? So essentially, every planet has a path that it travels, and every planet has nodes. It has a north node and a south node. And basically, the south node represents the most southerly point that that planet can travel at that point in time. And the north node represents the most northerly point that that planet will travel as part of going around the planet from our perspective, certainly. And so astrologically speaking, what I find really interesting, especially in modern astrology, the nodes that are the most widespread among modern astrologers today, by far the most widely used are the nodes of the moon. And the moon is a symbol of many things in an astrology chart, but I think of it also as representing comfort and emotional fulfillment. And it represents something about being at peace with ourselves, within our bodies, certainly within our skin, certainly, but also at home in the world. And when you think about what home is, it is your comfort zone. It is a metaphor for our comfort zone. And so I think the fact that it is the nodes of the moon that are the most widely used in modern astrology today, it says something about our, whether it's an unconscious awareness of our understanding that to know comfort, to move in a direction of being at peace with ourselves, of being at ease in the world, is a spiritual journey and a spiritual urge that we have. And the way that I understand the nodes is that the south node, it has spoken to another way to understand it, has to do with past lives and where we've been, but it has to do with what is most familiar, sort of our default. But the north node represents our karmic contracts, what it is that we most desire to do in this lifetime, and the direction in which the soul desires to go in this lifetime, especially as it connects to the archetypal energy of the moon. Again, individual journey, certainly in the individual chart, but as part of the collective as well. And so all planets, just like the moon, has a conscious journey, meaning that the planets speak to what we want and why we want it and how we go about getting it. But the nodes go deeper. They speak to the spiritual intention of that planet. And again, in this case, the moon. So when it is that the nodes, for example, right now, we have the North Node in the sign of Cancer. This is speaking powerfully to a collective urge that we have to understand something about family, about connection, about community, and yes, about country as well, about ancestry and very basic identity. This is something that as a collective, all of us in our different places in the world are seeking to explore. But of course, with the South Node moving through the sign of Capricorn right now as well, we are coming to understand something about where we have been, where it comes to understanding power and the structures that have held us together so far. Now, ultimately, I do think that being aware of the nodes, whether it is in your natal chart, whether it is by transit, and certainly for the collective, is ultimately one very powerful way to align with the intention that the soul has set for this time and also for this lifetime. Now, very quickly, again, because I know it's going to be talked about by somebody else, but the Pluto-Saturn conjunction, this is something that a lot of astrologers have been talking about for a really long time. I know that even lay people or just consumers of astrology, if you will, are intrigued by this because it has been so talked about. And I think rightly so. It is a really big deal. We are going to have the conjunction of Pluto and Saturn in the sign of Capricorn, and that is going to happen in January. And the last time that this happened in the sign of Capricorn, it was the one of the things that it was. Again, I know it's going to be explored a little bit further during this afternoon. But one of the things that it denoted was what we call the Protestant Reformation. So it was the start of this whole new understanding of power that took place 500 years ago, the last time Pluto and Saturn met in the sky. The thing is, though, that is a very iconic moment. When we think about this shift in power and who has the power, we think about this very iconic moment having to do with Martin Luther and his theses. But the thing is that nothing exists in a vacuum. Nothing comes out of nowhere. And the stage was set long before we get to this iconic moment in history where it feels like the trajectory changed and who had the power went through a shift as well. And it is this year in 2019 that I actually think is more important in some ways than the actual conjunction, because this is the year that is setting the stage. This is the activation of the South Node with Pluto and Saturn, yes. But then which direction are we going, right? Where is it that we are desiring to go as a collective? It is the activations of the North Node that are pointing the way to that. And so if you want to explore further about the archetypes of Pluto and the archetypes of Saturn, there is a myth from the Epic of Gilgamesh that I really like, and it's called Inanna's Descent. Again, it's on my website, but also you can read about that online as well, which I think just perfectly encapsulates what it is to go through a Pluto transit. And when you think about how it is that we are in the process right now of uncovering, of dissolving, and ultimately of realizing what is essential and what is real, it is the journey that we are on this year that is helping us to do just that, to tap into a clearer understanding of where we have been as part of setting the stage to which way we are going. So which way are we going? Well, it is going to be this month that helps us to gain that clarity thanks to Mars. So before I dive into what is exactly happening in the sky, I did want to take a moment to talk about a Jungian perspective when we look at Mars, a mythological perspective when we look at Mars as well, and to explore the glyph a little bit as well. So Carl Jung identified what he called the anima and the animus, and that's just another way of saying female energy and male energy, our receptive energy and our active energy. It is the action principle and the intuitive receptive principle. And there are certain planets that we can look to further understand what it is that we understand as our own masculine energy. What is it that we understand as our own feminine energy? And we all have that combination. And it is a whole and healthy and individualized person who is able to acknowledge these two parts of us, these two urges that we have. On the one hand, to know ourselves and to act from that place, to exert our truth in the world, which is part of what Mars represents. And on the other hand, to listen, to attract, to be receptive to the world around us, to allow, is another part of the human psyche and the human experience that is also very natural. And so the healthy individual will have an awareness of both and will have a balance of both. It is Mars that represents that active and masculine principle within the psyche. And I think we can actually see this when we look at the glyph of Mars itself. And this idea of the circle and of the arrow, these are symbols that have been explored at length by Jungian analysts as well, including Jung himself rather. And so the circle represents and has represented as part of human history a sense of completion, a sense of wholeness, a sense of self-knowing and holding your own space and knowing who you are and having an appreciation of the limits of who you are, but in a way that ultimately allows you to move beyond those limits. It is a very spiritual, a deeply spiritual symbol in that it does represent a wholeness and the awareness of your wholeness. Now, what is the ultimate awareness of our wholeness? Well, it is rooted in an understanding that our energy is divine. And I think this understanding of ourselves as divine beings, as encapsulated by the glyph of Mars, we can actually see this when we read and when we look at some of Homer's work, including the Odyssey and the Iliad. And so what is striking to me when you find yourself reading, as one does find themselves reading Homer's work, is that as you are reading this, I realized that, you know, one amazing thing, one incredible contribution that the ancients gave us, we can say that astrologers are continuing this contribution, but it's like they went around as they lived their life, okay, and they would have a strong emotion, okay, and then they would have this emotion, they'd say, oh my God, this is a strong emotion. This must be a god. And so just about every aspect of the human experience, everything that we could feel was understood as divine, was given the providence of a different divine figure. And when you do read Homer's work, we actually see this playing out with Mars as well, where we see that, yes, Mars can represent the active principle, and yes, war as well is part of this. Now, I don't want to say that to scare anybody, right? There are ways in which we can be warriors for love in our own lives, and we'll explore that as well just in a few moments. But what we also see is that Mars is understood as a planet of reflection, of strategy, of wisdom. And I believe that the circle represents that. But it is the arrow that arises from the circle that allows us to consider how our actions can be guided from wholeness. How it is that in being willing to hold space, to know yourself, to think about the possibilities, about who you are and what it means to truly be you in the world, that the most effective action can take place. And what you notice when you read Homer's work is that he actually has prayers to Aries/Mars, where he's talking about guide my actions, guide my anger. And I thought that this was really intriguing because not only is this in some ways alluding to what we today consider psychological, right? This whole idea that just because you have Mars in your chart means that you're going to get angry or you're going to have burns or whatever. That isn't necessarily always the case. Even to ancient people, they understood that these were energies you could work with, that you could direct, that you could bring your own awareness to use this energy towards a higher aim. And we actually see this in terms of the prayers offered and written about by Homer, that even in ancient times, people were encouraged to tap into these energies and to contemplate their higher application. And so it is now. We have Mars powerfully activating a a spiritual intention point in the sky, essentially elevating this energy and encouraging us as part of our individual journeys and as a collective to understand who we are and what it means to act from that place with wisdom and guidance in truth, and not to just necessarily to act from a place of impulsivity. I don't think that's likely, because when we are exploring the North Node, we are much more likely to access any energy activating the North Node, or at least we'll be encouraged to access it from its higher spiritual application. Now, Mercury. What I find especially intriguing about what is going to be happening once we get you, or once we get ourselves just past the exact conjunction, is that very soon, within days, really, Mercury will also conjunct the North Node as well. And I found this very intriguing, because I think if you just look at Mars in and of itself, it can be a very overpowering energy. And yes, Mars and that sense of the physical exertion, the physical strength, the physical show, the boisterous quality of Mars, it can evoke fear when people see that. But I think the fact that Mercury is so close by, the fact that Mercury is going to ensure that it is also not only with Mars, but meeting the North Node in the sky as well, means that we will have the opportunity to elevate this energy. And so here you can see in the image that I am sharing that we have here, sorry about that. Oh, what happened? Go back. Thank you. Please go back. Let me see here. I'm sorry. I don't know what happened here. I'm trying to go back and it's not allowing me to. Yikes. Oh, yay. Thank you, Mercury, for being with us there in the moment. That T-square is active right about now, right? That Gemini standing across or opposing Jupiter squaring Neptune. So we are obviously in the T-square. I'm going to give what just happened to the T-square. So Mercury. I put here an image of the chakras because I feel like this is a powerful representation of mercurial energy and how Mercury can actually help us in this moment. When you think about therapy and the process that people go through when they go through therapy, how is it that psychoanalysis, as Jung would put it, changes lives profoundly? It has been understood that what psychoanalysis can do is it can help to raise the energy. And what that means is when you think about times that are hard, times that are challenging in your life, it can feel as if the things that you feel in your body, right, in your gut, can feel overpowering, can feel difficult. And it is in some ways Mars that represents those lower chakras. Unless we consciously start tapping into it, Mars can be that very physical part of the human experience. But Mercury is mind. And in order to get to mind, you essentially have to rise above the physical aspect of life and move the energy through the chakras towards the heart, beyond the heart, and towards the mind. And in this way, and in understanding our emotions differently, we are able to transform them. We're able to transform the energy and feelings that we hold in our lower chakras, in our gut, in our body, those very emotions that have made life come to a point where we know we need to change, and that bring us to a process of psychotherapy, for example. But that alchemical process that therapy promises, well, it happens by raising that energy from the lower chakras to the higher chakras with the help of the Mercury energy, with the help of mercurial archetype. I am reminded of, and this is something I had the great pleasure of writing an article for OPA for the latest issue with Kelly Surtees. So that article is written by both of us. And in that article, I wrote about Plotinus. And Plotinus is one of these people who is considered one of the ancient godfathers of modern esoteric practice today in the West. So an incredibly influential figure. And he was instrumental in the foundational understanding we have today of astrological magic. And what Plotinus said was that you could gather at the right astrological hour. You could gather all of your correspondences, as he called it, which is basically the herbs that you need and the stones that you need that correspond with the astrological hour, that corresponds with the intention, what it is you're desiring to create, right? You can get together and you can have the correspondences to the angels that you wish to evoke to help you with your stated intention as part of practicing astrological magic. But until you speak the word, your intention has not manifested. And as soon as you do speak the word, what it is that you are intending, what stated intention you have, has already manifested. It is ultimately word. It is ultimately Mercury that allows your intention to be made manifest into reality. And in this way, Plotinus understood Mercury to be an intermediary, if you will, between what ultimately would just be energy, would just be a feeling, a hope, a desire, and what can then be translated into changed circumstances. It is Mercury that facilitates that middle ground between what is happening energetically and what shows up in your life. And to ensure that you are creating with intention, you want to ensure that you are using the power of word and the power of Mercury to get you there. Now, I also wanted to share this very quickly about Mercury. I found this on Wikipedia. I'm sure my professors are, shaking their fists to the heavens right now if they're hearing me at all, because that is a big academic no-no to go on Wikipedia to quote Wikipedia. But I did it here because I thought it was good. So I did it, and very succinct. And so on Wikipedia here, what I found so intriguing is that Mercury was understood in Roman times as a god of financial gain, of commerce, of eloquence, messages, communication, but that includes divination as well, which I think is why he's such a powerful symbol in astrological magic in that tradition. But also travelers, boundaries, luck, and trickery and thieves, right? And so we are going to want to ensure that we are accessing Mercury in its higher end. Now, we are going to get to the major configuration now, because I think all of these, what Mercury represents, is going to be important to watch. Here we are. The larger configuration, again, many of you may recognize this. This is the image from the OPA Facebook page, the discussion Facebook page that was generously shared by Maurice. So here's the thing we can see, right? Here we have, I don't think I have a pointer, so I'll just speak it, right? Talking about Mercury, I will speak it. Here we have Mars moving over the North Node. And Mars can be a symbol of boisterousness and shows of power. The fact that Mercury is so close by, I think we are going to want to be aware of how it is that those very themes that I just spoke about having to do with Mercury may show up for us as a collective. And I think we've already seen a little bit of it where there was, collectively speaking, again, I don't like to talk politically because I like to bring people together, that's in my chart, I think. I like to unify people. And I think that politics can be one thing that divides us. But if I can tread lightly here, given that I am a resident of Mexico too, and a Canadian. So we very recently had some boisterous talk about things like tariffs, about how that would affect commerce. But it was ultimately Mercury, the ability to communicate, that has been able to elevate the energy that will ultimately allow mercurial endeavors like commerce to continue unimpeded between countries. And so we saw this as a collective, and I feel like what is happening in the sky right now is a great symbol for a great symbolic way to understand what has been happening for the collective, or at least for relations between the United States and Mexico, where we have seen this very archetype play out in very powerful ways recently. where we have,
So
yeah,
just
go ahead, Maurice.
sorry to interrupt. We're running a bit out of time.
Oh dear, I'm so sorry. Once I
So
start talking, I think I'm fascinating, and I apologize for that. So let
you are,
me, yes,
but
okay.
let me
Yes.
just try to bring the ideas together so people, can implement that easily in their lives. So you're basically referring to the conjunction of Mercury and Mars on the North Node in Cancer, possibly, bringing that intensity of Mars to a communication and trade dimension. So it's not
Right.
necessarily physical, but it can get verbal. It can get, it has a lot to do with negotiations as well. Is that your
I believe so. Like, I believe with Mars in Cancer, the North Node in Cancer, there is an association with the energy of Cancer with countries, right? With this very foundational identity that we can hold. And it is ultimately Mercury that is helping to elevate the energy. So it doesn't just stay in that space of emotion and exertion, but rather is allowing us to get to that place where we're able to have understanding and agreements take place.
Okay.
Now, very quickly, I did want to mention, because as Maurice said, I am running out of time, but I wanted to mention, as Maurice encouraged me to point out as well with his astrological brilliance, 18 degrees, right? This idea of 18 being an activating principle in this larger, what we see here, a kite formation that is taking place now as we speak. Now, I was very fascinated by this idea of 18, not looking at Sabian symbols, because that can get really exact for all 360 degrees, but just the number 18 in and of itself. According to numerology by Linda Goodman, she uses Hebrew Chaldean numerology. And I have found her work brilliant in that regard where it comes to numerology. But she described the number 18 as a number of Mars. It is the number that Mars vibrates to, which I thought was so intriguing, because this whole kite formation essentially is pointing at Mars. It is Mars ultimately that is receiving all this energy from these other big planets. And then we have the number 18 itself representing a spiritual and material conflict. And I think that, again, this is where Mercury can be really helpful in helping us to essentially elevate the energy, so that it isn't just about the spiritual and material, but it becomes more about integration and understanding. Now, I did want to very quickly point out the moment that I thought would be really important as part of this larger configuration as well was going to be coming up a little further once we get into July. So yes, we're going to have eclipses. That's going to be spoken about a little bit later. But the fact that Venus is going to get to the North Node as we move into the second half of July, I think that is going to be very powerful as well, because that is going to allow us to integrate the feminine principle. Where it is that we have had Mars, and we are having Mars as a highly active, very, I want to say it can be aggressive, but it can also be very determined. It can be very focused energy. And then we have Mercury, which is essentially understood as a more, or has been contemplated in mythology as a more androgynous figure. And so it can be considered as rises above this idea of masculine and feminine, active and receptive. So we have that sort of mediating principle happening right now as well with Mercury. It is ultimately going to be, once Venus steps in, that's going to allow us to listen to each other and to allow things to ease and move in a direction of feeling a sense of reward as a result of the personal and perhaps also the collective work that we may do at this time to move ourselves forward and to integrate the lessons that are showing up for us now.
Thank you so much, Nadiya.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
And do check Nadiya's channel on YouTube, and as you can read here, on Instagram and Facebook. And I also want to share, just one moment, I'm going to share a slide here. We will have all the presenters also submit a written article about what they're just talking about, what they're presenting in our next issue of the Career Astrologer, which is coming out on the solstice on around June 21st, 22nd. So if you miss anything, if you want to review anything, first of all, you'll get a recording of this session, but you can also revert to the written article. So you can go to OPA's website, Publications, Career Astrologer. Thank you so much, Nadiya, and let's welcome April. I'm going to stop sharing here. April, you're muted. I'm unmuting you. I think I can do that.
Okay, unmute now. I am no longer muted. I am here with you, Maurice. Hello.
Welcome and thank you for being available and having so much to share. And eclipses are always a fascinating aspect of astrology. I think there's a lot of mystery around it, but it's so powerful. So many things are centralized around eclipses. Mm-hmm. So it's all happening now in Cancer Capricorn.
Yeah, a lot of people are really frightened on the subject of eclipses, so it's good to include them in a webinar like this one, where the idea is to say, you know, how can we actually work with them rather than just letting them paralyze us.
Yeah. And a quick note, you can check April's work on her website as well. April is based in San Diego, California, and she's the head of a local astrology organization, which is named Big Sky.
My website is bigskyAstrology.com, and our local group is the San Diego Astrological Society.
Wonderful. So, eclipses.
Eclipses, yes. Well, let me share my screen with you. Hold on just a moment. We'll share this and get this going in the beginning. All right, there we are. So I really am thrilled to be participating in this particular webinar today with these particular colleagues who are so brilliant and so lovely. And it's so wonderful to share virtual time with all of you. And hello to all of you OPA-ites out there. And thank you, Maurice, for including me and for that wonderful introduction. I'm really thrilled to be talking about a topic that is very near and dear to my heart and has been ever since I started practicing astrology, and that is the astrology of eclipses. Because over the years, they've become one of my really favorite tools for anticipating moments of crisis and change. Now, eclipses are very often used in mundane astrology to predict major world events, but I'm a natal astrologer. I like to deal with people and natal charts. So my focus today is really going to be on how to use eclipses to better understand cycles of critical change in a birth chart. So what I'm going to cover today is, first of all, just a few basics about eclipses, the meaning of them as far as I'm concerned in astrology, the eclipse signs of Cancer and Capricorn for this year, working with eclipses and cycles, specifically the two eclipses that we have in July, and then I'm going to show you an example chart to show you kind of the process I use in working with these with a client. So the basics of eclipses is we have this idea that eclipses are very rare, and really they're very common. We have at least one solar eclipse every 6 months when the new and full moons conjoin the lunar nodes. A new moon is a solar eclipse, a full moon is a lunar eclipse. So we may have a lunar eclipse within 2 weeks of a solar eclipse. Eclipses, I think the astrology of eclipses represents change and crisis. And the house placement of eclipses in your birth chart and aspects to your natal planets will show where this change and crisis are likely. Now, when I say a word like crisis, we feel a little panicky. It's a really nasty sounding word, and I want to talk about what I mean when I say crisis. It's just another way of saying you are at a turning point, that your life can no longer go on in the same way that it was going before, and you have to change and go in another direction. Happy occasions are just as likely as unhappy ones to create a crisis in your life. If you talk to somebody who has just gotten married, or has just had a child, or some phenomenal success in their life, they will all seem a little less happy than you would expect them to be in the circumstances, because their whole life has gotten completely turned upside down. They're in a state of crisis. It doesn't mean they regret their decisions. It doesn't mean their life is terrible. It just means things have changed in a big way. So the eclipses this year are mostly in the signs of Cancer and Capricorn. We did have one little outlier in Leo in the beginning of the year. I think the signs that the eclipses are operating in speak of the collective crisis that we're all going through. And this has been a critical time, beginning with the first eclipse we had in Cancer in July of 2018, through the final eclipse we will have in these signs in July of 2020. The collective crisis is around things like parents and family and ancestry. As Nadiya was saying, our tribal identifications, the countries and political parties that we might subscribe to. Home and relocation, of course, are very important. Caretaking, our career ambitions, our responsibilities, and our reputations. The South Node is moving through Capricorn. Now, eclipses are a consequence of a particular alignment of the Sun, the Moon, the Earth, and the lunar nodes. So we know that they carry this nodal energy. So the South Node being in Capricorn and traveling along with Saturn and Pluto talks about the energy that we are being asked to release. You know, if we look at the nodal axis as an evolutionary one, and I'm not an evolutionary astrologer per se, but I have no problem with the concept that we are evolving, we are growing, and that the South Node represents, whether you're talking about past lives or this lives, the things that have really outlived their usefulness for us. So an analogy I like to use about the South Node is, it's really great to start out in a family and in a home where you're supported and you're taught the skills that you're going to need to go out into the world and be productive and take care of yourself. The problem comes if you never leave home. You know, you're just kind of like one of these people that's still living in mom and dad's basement, you know, in your 40s, and they're upstairs cooking your meals. So the way I think of the nodes is the South Node is what you're already good at. You've mastered it, you've learned it, and now it's time to go out into the world toward the North Node and do something with that, with all of this. So I think of the South Node less as this really gnarly place with a lot of cosmic garbage, you know, that we have to, you know, take out the trash, and more in terms of what is it that I've really learned here that now I need to take out into the world. So I think eclipses are the moment in this cycle that really activate that process of getting from the South Node to the North Node. So I think with the South Node in Capricorn, we can say we want to release the negative attributes of Saturn and Pluto and Capricorn. So anything like authoritarianism or harshness, a need for control and power, and excessive ambition that overtakes our lives and really obscures our personal connections and commitments. The things we've really learned with the South Node in Capricorn are things about self-sufficiency, taking care of ourselves, the ability to make a plan and stick to it. These are all good things that we can now take forward into the North Node. The North Node, of course, is moving through the sign of Cancer. And what we're being asked to embrace, I think, at this time as a culture is the path with heart, tenderness and caretaking, commitments to the people we love. I was recently on a speaking trip in Arizona, and I was supposed to go for a week and go to several cities. And at the end of my commitments in the first city, we got a call from our neighbor that our cat was terribly sick and she had to take her to the emergency vet. And it was serious. It was really bad. And so by the next morning, we're supposed to move on to the next city. And I'm kind of going, do I go home or do I go to the next city? Do I fulfill my professional obligation, which is the South Node in Capricorn? Or do I go in the direction of taking care of my beloved little pet? And once I put it together with the nodal axis, which fortunately sprung into my mind, I knew exactly what to do. Because up to that point, I was stuck. I really didn't know which direction to take. So I think a guiding principle for us in this time with the nodes going through these signs and the eclipses specifically in these signs is, am I taking care of the things of the heart that really need my total attention and my total care? So here's how I actually work with eclipses in a practical way. First, I will find out the house position of the eclipse point in the chart. So the upcoming solar eclipse on July 2nd happens at about 10 degrees of Cancer. So it's just simply finding what house that falls in your chart. And that's important information. Then I see, does the eclipse point make a hard aspect to natal planet or angles? And I only use the conjunction, the square, and the opposition. When people come to me and say, oh, I'm having this eclipse that's trying my Venus, I'm like, okay, that's nice information, but it's probably not going to do much, because the energy of eclipse isn't an energy of crisis. And while trines and sextiles can precipitate crisis, they don't tend to, in the same way a conjunction, a square, or an opposition does. My focus is to try to get to the things that really pop, that really send a strong message. And these are the aspects that really seem to do it with eclipses. I use a 4-degree orb, which is actually pretty generous with eclipses. A lot of people will narrow that to 1 or 2 degrees. But I find that, for instance, with this eclipse, if you have any planets in your chart or important points between 4 degrees and 14 degrees of a cardinal sign, this is an important eclipse for you.
So I have a quick question.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
When you speak about the conjunctions, for example, and let's say the eclipse on the 2nd of July is going to be around 10 degrees Cancer, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to pull the chart here. Do you also look at, I'm going to share the chart for just one moment and then revert back to you. Do you also look at aspects, if the eclipse is 10 degrees, do you also look at aspects at 17 where the nodes are, or only where the sun moon is?
Really where the sun moon is, and the way eclipses work, of course, is they can only be a particular distance away from the nodes to happen. But it can be quite wide. And you can have these really, that's when you have really small eclipses that are barely visible anywhere. So generally speaking, I'm not going to expand it out to the degree of the node.
Okay, so we're focusing in this case on July 2nd at the 10-degree Cancer.
Yes, and then we'll talk about the lunar eclipse that really pulls in the Pluto a lot more and the nodes.
Okay, thank you. Just clarifying.
That's a good question. And there's Maurice. Hi, Maurice. Okay, so I need to reshare then. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And go share. Okay, and we are back. So this brings me to the next point on the slide, which is that I am going to look at outer planets that are close to the eclipse point that influence the nature of the eclipse. So that's why we're going to look at Saturn and Pluto, because if a person's having an eclipse that's close to a natal planet or angle, that means they're also getting Saturn, Pluto at the same time, and that's important information. Always with eclipses, the lunar nodes are going to be implicated because they're part of the process. But it's a question of how close they are. Now this, for some reason, okay. The next part of the process, and the thing where it really comes alive for me, is to review the previous years in this eclipse cycle. For connections, and talk to the person about, well, what happened during these years that might have been connected to the nature of that planet and those house placements. And then we can talk about that. And it's like a thread running through a tapestry. So I'll show you, as I said, an example chart later on. So here are the eclipses for this year. And as you'll see, most of them are in Capricorn. So we're getting a lot of eclipse energy around the sign of Capricorn. We do have the big solar one that we're going to talk about in July. And we did have this little outlier at 1 degree almost of Leo in January, which brings me to an important point, which is that eclipses move backwards like the lunar nodes through the signs. So the previous eclipse cycles were in Aquarius and Leo. Then they move into Capricorn and Cancer, then Sagittarius and Gemini, and so on. So they're kind of moving backwards. Eclipses occur near the same degrees of the zodiac about every 19 years. This is a little separate from the Saros cycle, which I'm not really going to go into today, but this is the Metonic cycle, which is there's an eclipse that happens pretty much on the same day and the same degree every 19 years. Produces about 4 or 5 series of these. And then at the same or opposing points about every 8 to 10 years. So, for instance, if we look at this eclipse on July 2nd, that's at 10 degrees of Cancer, we know that we can go back 19 years and find an eclipse at the same degree. And there it is, in the year 2000. And then in between that, at some point, we are going to find another one at that same degree. And it's usually about 5 years, but this ended up being, quite a ways through the cycle. And then 19 years before that, this is, pretty close, at about 8 degrees. So basically, this is the cycle that I would be working with and going back and finding the previous times that eclipses fell at that degree, because that tells me if a person has the sun at 10 degrees or 8 degrees of Cancer or whatever, within a few degrees of this, that these should be pretty important eclipses for them. And if I go back in time and see when the previous eclipses were, I can hear their story, exactly how it's played out for them. So let's talk about this solar eclipse on July 2nd, which is at about 10 degrees, 37 minutes of Cancer. Solar eclipses, of course, happen at the new moon, and I find that we feel them most strongly in the week before they happen. There's a lot of discussion among people about when do you start to feel an eclipse, how long are they in effect, these kinds of things. What I really find is on the ground, when I'm talking to clients, they are feeling it the week before in a big way. Now, the overall influence of an eclipse, you're going to start to see events probably a few months in advance of this or even a few months after. Depends on what's being triggered in the client's chart. Solar eclipses to me are very much of the nature of Uranus. It's that buzzing kind of energy that we associate with Uranus. At the time of a solar eclipse, the moon is obscuring the sun. So symbolically, we would say that lunar qualities like emotionalism and intuition tend to overwhelm the solar functions, the sanity, the sense of one's security and selfhood. So it's a time when it's a little bit like throwing a toaster into your bathtub or something, and things are you have a whole lot of energy, and it's not a super rational time either. So that's important to know going into those seasons. This one occurs on July 2nd, and in London it's at 8:16 p.m. and you can adjust for your time zone. But for everybody, the eclipse point and the planetary placements are the same. So the eclipse point is at 10 degrees 37 Cancer, and it is in a pretty good opposition with Saturn. I think it's way too far to consider Pluto in this one, but there it is. So that's important. That tells us the energy of this eclipse very much has a Saturn component. And what we will likely hear from our clients or notice in our own lives is the sense of some kind of obstacles that have to be overcome, or responsibilities that are imposed on us, perhaps, that we didn't ask for, or responsibilities that we willingly take on, but we don't necessarily take them on from the most informed place. So if you're in a place where your whole life is kind of buzzing with a lot of Uranian energy, and you feel a little unstable and not really grounded, it's really easy to reach out to something that looks like a secure and stable lifeline, like a life raft that you then hold on to. And that can be Saturn things. Saturn is sometimes like a little playpen that we put ourselves into so we can stay safe. So I think the major challenge of this eclipse, quite apart from putting it into a birth chart, is how do I keep myself feeling sane and stable without taking on obligations that are not necessarily going to suit me after the eclipse is over. So I would just say this is not the best time to make big, major decisions that are liable to commit you for a super long period of time. Also important in this chart is the conjunction of Mercury and Mars up here, and that goes back to some of the stuff that Nadiya was talking about as well, with how do we use Mercury as sort of a champion for that Mars, and a little more effective of a mouthpiece for the things that we want to go out and do than Mars tends to be. And they are both square Uranus. So here's more of that buzzy Uranian energy that we already associate with eclipses. So this says also we need to be a little bit careful in how we talk to people, right? Because we'll tend to shoot from the hip. You know, maybe we'll want to clear the air and talk about some things that have been bothering us for a while with this Mercury Mars. And it just comes out of nowhere, and then you're stuck with the consequences of it. And then we're back to Saturn territory of, oh, I have really changed something about the whole structure of a relationship or job or something I'm doing in my life. So Jupiter is also square Neptune in this one. I'm not really going to go into that because Kim's going to do a great job of filling us in on that, but I just wanted to mention it as an important component of this chart. The past years that I'd really be talking to a client about with this eclipse would be most recently 2011, then 2000, 1992, 1982, 1973, and you can go back, you know, by looking in your ephemeris and finding out when these were. But what I will often do with a client ahead of time, if I'm going to be talking to them about eclipses, is to give them those years and say, take a little time before we meet and think about the major things that were going on in your life, particularly with regard to, and then I have the house it's in for them and the planets it's aspecting. The lunar eclipse is going to be on July 16th. It's at 24 degrees Capricorn and 4 minutes. A lunar eclipse, of course, happens at the full moon. And what the way I think of a lunar eclipse is we tend to reach out and look for earthly solutions to emotional problems. And the reason for this is the Earth is casting its shadow on the moon. So the Earth is kind of that earthy, the physical energy is really taking precedence, I would say, over the emotional nature, which is kind of contradictory to how we might tend to think of a lunar eclipse. But you think about it, the lunar self is being suppressed, is being overshadowed in some way. So what will often happen at this time is people are feeling something emotional that is a little difficult to deal with on an emotional level. So they'll look, again, for something tangible to hold on to. This is like the personification of that eclipse Saturn energy we saw in the July 2nd chart, because this is a moon in earthy Capricorn. It's there with Saturn and Pluto, and it's really, really trying to find a solution, a scheme, a formula that will make sense of where we are and help us move forward from that. Lunar eclipses are particularly important for relationships. And it's, you know, full moons are generally, but a lunar eclipse especially so, because the sun and the moon stand in opposition to each other. There is nothing impeding their view of each other. So they see each other totally. They behold each other. There's no place to hide. So a lunar eclipse, especially one like this one, is pretty volatile. We have the sun with Venus and the North Node in this beautiful, cozy looking Cancerian space. Opposed, a very different moon in Capricorn with Saturn and Pluto. And what this tells me is, you know, this is ground zero for the whole summer where I'm concerned, because this is like the sharks and jets really facing off. You know, we've got these really sweet, cuddly guys over here, the sun, the Venus, the North Node, and opposed from them is this really, really intense, harsh, difficult, lonely planets of the moon with Saturn and Pluto. So
just
yeah, go ahead,
quick question, April. Also, we're about to go over time, but I was wondering, how long do you think the impact of the eclipse are? Because I know some people, you know, there are many different opinions about, you know, how active those degrees are. over weeks beyond the eclipse. Even some people say they're active before the eclipse is actually
Yes, I think they
coming
are.
into place.
Yeah, I find at the midpoint. So when you find the new moon at the midpoint of the eclipses, so in Aries and in Libra, those are trigger points definitely for the eclipses. Any fast-moving planets that are going to aspect those points. And some people will go for years with it. I remember hearing that people would say a year for every minute of the eclipse. You know, this was
A
active.
year for every minute? What does that
Yeah,
mean?
I've heard that, yeah. It's not how I work with them. But
Mhm.
like I say, I'm really looking heavily at the week before because that's when people are becoming conscious of it. And definitely, I'm watching the faster moving transits after the fact that are triggering that point, especially things like,
So you would say the midpoint, so basically 3 months prior, 3 months
yeah,
after.
definitely, definitely. I just wanted to show you a quick example of working with a client who I'll call Annette. And I liked her chart because it has Venus there at 11 degrees of Cancer, so that pulls the solar eclipse point. And she has this really volatile combination of Sun, Uranus, square Neptune. So when she has this eclipse cycle, all of these guys are getting activated, plus her 8th house. So we know that the 2nd and the 8th houses, especially with Venus involved, there's likely to be some financial stuff that you want to talk about. With the 8th house, she has had a lot of experiences around death and passings in this eclipse series. So in 1963 and 64, her mother almost died from breast cancer. Her godmother died of an aneurysm. And that's an example of the April 64. That's 3 months after the eclipse. So certainly at the trigger point. In 1973, she, on her actual birthday, which was like 2 days after the lunar eclipse, she said she lost her virginity in an unpleasant way to a man who she had had all of these romantic illusions about. And I'm hearing really that Sun Neptune. And that eclipse was in the 8th house. So from the 8th to 5th certainly speaks of that sexuality component, resulting in an unplanned pregnancy and an abortion that did not go well. In 82, she had the sudden shocking suicide of her fiance in December, just 2 weeks before this eclipse at 8 degrees of Cancer, close to her Venus. And she came into a substantial inheritance, which I think speaks of that fallout in the 8th house as well. At the time, it's important to know that she did also have transiting Pluto square Sun Uranus. So those are important things that you're going to take into consideration. In 91 and 92, she started working for an astrology company that ended up bringing a substantial amount of income to her. In 2000, 2001, she started working on a book. She moved to a new city to work with that same metaphysical company, making a good salary with them. And in, I think it was 2011, somehow that got lost from the slide, she lost that job, which so overnight she lost half her income. In that same year, her father died in January, and then she got a really substantial inheritance from him and started renovating the family home. Son rolls forth. So, you know, we were talking the other day and she said, well, we're just going to have to see what happens with this eclipse this summer. And she texted me a couple of days ago and said that her half-sister had just been diagnosed with lung cancer. So that sort of continues this theme in the chart of losing, especially maternal figures that are important to her. There will be no inheritance with this one. And what will probably happen is she has to take on more burden and responsibility for traveling to see her sister and be there for her. And that speaks of that energy of the July eclipse we talked about before, with the sun and moon opposed Saturn. So basically, not every eclipse is going to hit you in a big way. Look at whether the eclipse point triggers a major configuration in your chart, and look at what past years in that cycle have brought to you. Ask yourself, what did I learn from previous years in this cycle? If I could do it again, would I do anything differently? She might have decided not to get in that relationship with that man that hurt her so badly when she was 18 years old, you know? So give yourself credit for what you learned from those experiences and ask, how did those years change me for the better? So when you're having an eclipse pattern like this one that is so volatile and has brought some really difficult events in the past, it's really easy to get frightened about it and think, oh my God, history is going to repeat itself. But we have to remember that eclipses are connected with the lunar nodes, and that what they're trying to do is move us from the safety zone of old patterns and towards something that is going to make us stronger and wiser. So the work of eclipses is always to move toward a better understanding of these tough patterns and to let ourselves be changed by them into something wiser and more complete. How's that for you, Maurice?
Thank you so much.
You're very
And, you know, I just want to share a quick personal experience with this, what you were speaking about, with Cancer Capricorn, is I've been very busy my whole life promoting astrology and working on so many different levels. And since it got into Cancer, I just want to be home.
Yes.
You know, it's that complete shift of energy. I've never seen it, you know, it's undeniable how powerful this is. And there's nothing, you know, externally triggering that. It's really more of a calling, a feeling. And
It's
so spending
permission.
time.
Yeah, a permission that we can give ourselves, I think, and knowing the astrology of it in the nodes has, like I said, you know, really powerful for me. It's like, yes, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. So follow your heart home to the couch. You know?
That's, you know, you speak about permission. I think it's an important word because society educates us and promotes more of the Capricorn energy. You know, do it on your own, be strong,
Yes.
don't give up. And we don't get so much encouragement to actually take time off, slow down. It's not, you know, it's not good for the economy.
Right.
So, yeah.
You've said it very well. It's an important time for that, and it really is the last thing on everybody's list each day is, did I get enough time with myself, let alone my family?
And one last thing, I just want to share a chart that I have here. There's an old saying that also mentions that kings and queens are born or die during eclipses.
Yeah.
And we see, I don't know if you can see the chart, Kate Middleton is born on a lunar eclipse.
Mm-hmm.
And Prince Williams is born on a solar eclipse, both of them in Cancer Capricorn.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see from an astrological point of view what happens in their lives.
Indeed it will.
Since they are really, you know, she's born on the lunar eclipse, and the current lunar eclipse is on those degrees.
Mm.
And he's born on a solar eclipse, and the solar eclipse is very close to
Cancer,
his early degree. So,
you know, you see with just regular individuals too, when an eclipse is close to their birthday, that they're asked to rise up and be the royalty of their own life, to be the sovereign of their own kingdom. And it can happen because a parent dies or because somehow they just get thrust in the limelight. And it can be uncomfortable to be that visible. And that is the eclipse energy of that. So yeah, that's a good point about William and Kate, who I like a lot.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we've mentioned Saturn and Pluto several times. They are the elephant and the mouse in the room. So Margaret, thank you for joining us and sharing your insights. Margaret is a psychological astrologer living in Dublin, and your website, do you want to...
Sorry, my website is astrologypsychological.com and also relationshipsandastrology.com.
Wonderful. And you've worked very closely with Armand Diaz.
Yes, he's my business partner, yes.
So it's a wonderful combination, to bring, we don't see many astrologers working like that together. So it's refreshing to see you both collaborating and working together. And here we are, Saturn, Pluto.
Thank you, Maurice. And like everyone said, it's an absolute joy to be here. And hello, everyone from Dublin, and hello to all the participants. It's just lovely. So the topic I'm talking about, of course, is the biggie, because we've all talked about this for quite a while, but now we're already in the energy. So it's not just something theoretical. It's actually something that we are all feeling to one degree or another, depending particularly how it affects our own chart. And the quote I put here, which I'm not sure it's actually fully visible, is "Love is an expression of power. We can use it to transform the world." I felt this was very relevant because one of the big emotions, and I work also as a psychotherapist, so I work with people's emotions every day. And one of the big ones that comes up when there are these huge transits in the sky is fear. And just to remember that love counteracts fear in a very, very real way. So just to keep that kind of at the back of our mind as we're talking about the transit. Now, we live in a mostly linear world. We want to know when something starts or when something ends. We go for a job and we think, when does the contract start? When does the contract end? So it's very much about having always a bookmarker somewhere so that we can actually understand what's going on around us. Yet these big transits are really like unending spirals. So the cycles start very much before us and will continue after us. I remember years ago when I was studying at the CPA, one of the lecturers said it's a bit like getting on a bus and getting off the bus. The bus started way before us and will continue way after us. And I think that's important to keep in mind because these transits feel so personal to us, and they are, because something is happening to us as individuals. Yet these are very big collective transits that are so much bigger than us and have a purpose which often is beyond us, but which impacts on us personally. So I think it's helpful to understand a little bit about what's going on the macro level and how might that impact and how might we deal with that on the more kind of micro level. So our experience of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, similarly to all the very big transits, really depends, in part on our natal chart. It also depends on our personal and collective development, on our level of consciousness. And that's not level of consciousness in the sense of a judgment of good or bad. It's just purely where we're at right now. And where are we at in our own developmental stage, both astrologically, physiologically, age-wise. For somebody who's going through it at their Saturn return, it's going to be very different than going through it, Saturn return, the first Saturn return is going to be very different than the second Saturn return. So we'll talk about that a little later. But first I wanted to say something about Saturn in Capricorn. And of course it started December 2017, goes on till 2020, March 2020. Saturn is really essentially about crystallization and manifestation. That's really the essence of what Saturn wants us to do. And it's very essential for incarnation on this planet. Its energy really brings us down to Earth. One of the key things psychologically and why Saturn sometimes doesn't have such a good reputation is because it's about separation. And we are social creatures. Yet, Nadiya brought up Jung, and of course Jung's life's work was about individuation and separation and individuation from our tribe, from our family. It's the process that often starts at adolescence and continues through most of our life. And it's not an easy process because the lunar part of us that wants to connect deeply with others, doesn't like that energy of separating, of having to stand on our own 2 feet, which, April also talked about. So it requires an ability to have the courage to develop our sense of self. And Saturn in Capricorn is in its own sign. So this energy of separation is particularly emphasized, which is possibly why there can be some fear around it. Saturn in Capricorn also requires hard work, which is also why it's not so popular. It requires perseverance, it requires stamina. It requires really the ability to set a goal and achieve that goal, go towards that goal. So it requires the ability to have endurance for what is required, and those qualities are not qualities that we necessarily always embrace. They're very useful qualities, and it all depends on the nature of our chart, because for somebody with a very earthy chart, these qualities can be pretty innate. But for somebody with an very airy or fiery, very dynamic chart, the degree of perseverance and commitment that can be required by Saturn in Capricorn can feel somewhat challenging. We need Saturn, of course, in our lives, a degree of Saturn, in order to set boundaries in our life. If we don't have sufficient boundaries, everything comes in on top of us. If we have too many boundaries, we create armor. And when we are in a place of fear, which Saturn in Capricorn can sometimes induce or bring to fore, I should say, rather than induce, then the fear factor can be huge and the armor can go up. And in our natal chart, as we all know, Saturn is about our defenses. And those defenses are very helpful because they get us through life in dealing with the challenges of life. However, depending in part how attachment went to a large part in early infancy, we develop defenses that help our survival in childhood, but aren't always necessary when we reach adulthood. But they can become a habit and a way of being in the world. So when Saturn in Capricorn as a transit will challenge those defenses. And that could be a useful thing, because often we have armoring we no longer need, or sometimes also challenges us to put up some defenses, and not defenses, to put up some boundaries around people. So if somebody is in the habit of always saying yes, or being a caretaker, or being used to really always being very acquiescent to other people, Saturn in Capricorn coming along and aspecting the chart can really say, hang on a second, what about you? And this is where Saturn in Capricorn brings us back to the sense of self. Who am I? Who am I at my core? So its purpose in Capricorn to examine, this is really just a summary, to examine, reconfigure, and rebuild key inner and outer structures. And the outer structures, part of it is Capricorn. And the external structures, which of course we're all familiar with, is political, educational, legal, financial, environmental, transport, relationship, medical, philosophical, religious. Those are some of the core structures which we as a collective consider important. They form the basis of our existence really on this planet on a day-to-day level. Now, internally, these can be translated, as we talked about, our inner defenses, our boundaries, also our sense of inner authority. Who is our inner authority? Is it ourselves, or do we always look externally? Our sense of security, which again is why this transit sometimes has some fear around it, because when we start messing with our sense of security with, finance or whatever, we get fearful. Not to forget the basics, bones, teeth, our skeleton. Finances, housing, our sources of food. And we're seeing a lot of that around being discussed. What is happening with food, about can we really continue to eat so much meat on this planet? Our beliefs, our family, our relationships, our work, and our learning. And with Saturn in Capricorn, the key thing is to remember that our authenticity is key. We cannot afford to not be authentic with this combination. Moving on to Pluto. Pluto is a whole different ballgame. And Pluto, as much as we can easily define Saturn, because remember that Saturn is the boundary holder between the personal and social planets and the transpersonal planets. So he's still within our reach. It's still an energy, an archetype of that we can, of Chronos, that we can relate to. We can relate to the god of time. We can relate to the mythology around time. When we come to Pluto, it's very difficult to put him in terms that we, or her, in terms that we can actually relate to in that personal way, because it's something beyond us. It's an energy that's a transpersonal energy beyond us. And so it's much easier for us to talk about the mythologies of Hades, the god of the underworld. And my favorite, Pele, of course, which Maurice, I'm sure, can relate to from us both living in Hawaii, which is so vibrant on the islands, because there's a sense really that the islands are constantly forming and reforming. And at any point, they really could dissolve into the ocean. And there is that sense with Pluto that there's an uncertainty. It's not something like Saturn that's tangible. This is something that is way beyond us. And it's almost difficult to even begin to understand these energies. And certainly we cannot control them. We can't even begin to control them, although we can try and contain them, which is what most of us do. So all kinds of drives. I mean, Nadiya mentioned, of course, the journey of Inanna. And the journey of Inanna is a wonderful journey, because as she goes down to visit her sister Ereshkigal, who's gone through enormous grief, she has to peel off the layers, all the layers of her external existence. So I think all of these mythologies, which we haven't got the time to go into now, but you can easily read up, all of these mythologies help us to understand the very primal world of Pluto. The very primal world of sexual instincts and drives, which Freud, of course, helped inform us about. The primal emotions of jealousy, of desire, of rage, of despair, and the compulsions of addictions, which really drive us at times to the brink of insanity and beyond. These all belong to the Plutonian sphere. So again, when we see a transit of Pluto coming along, joining forces with something else which is also powerful, we start to wonder, what is really going on? And at times we can so easily feel overwhelmed, because what Pluto brings up is the shadow area, the unconscious, that which is hidden from us, from our consciousness. And its energy is really a transformational and transmutational energy. So again, here we're looking at, the structures we looked at before, because Capricorn, the same structures. The difference is how Pluto goes about dealing with it. This is about transmuting something. This is not just about experiencing something. And the key with Pluto and Capricorn is self-empowerment or feeling overpowered. So the more we can focus on our self-empowerment, the less likely we are to feel overpowered. I would describe the first stage with Pluto in Capricorn is always, or Pluto in any sign in fact, but is always the process of excavation. And then the second stage is like a detox, clearing out. So when we're in the process of excavation, all the murk comes to the surface. And unless it comes up, we don't know what there is to clear out. So imagine you're dredging up, a pond in your garden. It's going to look very silty and very kind of dirty initially. And it's not going to feel very comfortable. But know that then the next process of detox comes along if we have the courage to look at what comes up. Now, the current Pluto-Saturn conjunction relates back, we have to go back to the Uranus-Pluto square to understand this conjunction. And between 2012 and 2015, we had this very powerful square, which gave us an opportunity, opened the doors really to the potential to do some of this excavating and to do some of this detoxing, and also to bring to light, to plant new seeds for a new way of being, which was more idealistic, which was totally new. And this was in all the areas of home, of health, of education, of the environment. Now, the big question is, did we plant seeds or did we put a plaster on it? And that's a question for all of us to consider at the moment, because what is happening now, what didn't happen then, there are going to be repercussions. So I would suggest that a very important question for all of us to ask ourselves in our own individual lives is, what did we clear out and renew, and what did we not clear out and renew? Because that's going to have an impact. So we're in the Saturn-Pluto conjunction, and if we did not clear out the kind of mess that came up, then we might well feel we're in over our heads. And this is what it might feel like. And sadly, this is what it looks like in parts of the world. So, you know, the issue of whether we did or not, well, you know, that's there. Now, Saturn and Pluto, if we think of them as energies, when we put them together, they are very different. We've got Saturn that wants manifestation, crystallization. Pluto wants disintegration. We've got Saturn who wants individual survival. And we've got Pluto who is concerned with universal evolution. You know, Saturn wants incarnation, visible conscious realm, grounded in earth. And here we have the invisible unconscious realm, the underworld, beyond earth-based time and space. Just a reminder that if you're feeling like you're in a pressure cooker, that's real, because these two energies are close together, working together, but have a very different feel about them. So the key is really trying to find ways to work with them. Now, as creatures of habit, as creatures who like our security, one of our big instincts when we're frightened is fight or flight. However, with these major forces, if we can surrender, then we can let go. And what we're letting go of is actually letting go of control. And the term surrender, you know, often clients will say to me, what do you mean by surrender? I just give up. No, you don't just give up. It's a very conscious process of letting go. It's a conscious process of letting go of control. That's what we're letting go of control of the outcome that we most want. And actually trusting the process and working with it. And that's very key with Saturn-Pluto. We can't talk about this conjunction without looking at the previous Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, because as we said before, they all build on each other. And we don't have a lot of time to go into them, but just the key themes of the one in Leo. This was post-World War II, and we just became aware, of course, of the horrors that the ego can create when it just totally goes, you know, completely uncontained. And what really this conjunction, I think, was teaching us was how to have heart. You know, how do we actually open our hearts? So that theme will continue into this conjunction. So again, keep that in mind. Back to the theme of love and heart. And back to the North Node in Cancer, which April was talking about. Heart, love, compassion, nurturing for ourselves and for others. Now, the conjunction in Libra, that was the time where there was the big AIDS, HIV crisis, where there was a lot of prejudice came to light. And one of the lessons there was equality and justice versus prejudice and fear. Again, a lot of these issues are coming to light at the moment in the collective, and they're also part of what's coming up within us. Now, conjunctions are key moments. They're very, very important times because they are the very start of that phase of the cycle. And so all of these starting points, then there's also, just skip down, there are some key future dates to keep in mind as part of the cycle. So these are dates to watch out for. The first square, which will give us a flavor, a greater flavor. Something is beginning to be worked out of what is set in motion right now. But the reason right now is crucial is because things are being set in motion, both within the greater collective and within our personal individual lives. So it is a time to pay attention. We cannot afford to be unconscious right now. The opposition, there is a clash. That is the halfway point where whatever was set in motion at the seeding point now, we have a choice. Do we go forward with this? Do we throw it out? Do we try and start something else? By the last square, we're going towards a revolution point, and the next conjunction is in Pisces. That's what we're working towards. Going back a second, this is the chart of the exact conjunction. I will come back. Maurice, how much time do I have left, please?
Just a few minutes, 5 minutes.
Okay, then I'm going to leave you this chart you can look at on your own. I want to briefly, before we, just because we're ending, just some suggestions to navigate the conjunction. Crucial, build a strong sense of self. That's what Saturn in Capricorn is asking us to do. Maintain our own truth and integrity. That's absolutely crucial at this time. Commit to what matters to you. Really spend some time focusing on what matters. Abide by the rules, and that's a really important one. This conjunction is affecting me personally. I've rarely even got a parking ticket in my life. About a month ago, I got caught for having my mobile phone in my hand. I was stuck at a traffic light, stuck in the middle of traffic, didn't think there was any problem, texting a friend to say I was late. I got points. He didn't even give me a warning. So I thought, okay, this Saturn-Pluto conjunction is serious. We have to abide by the rules. Face your greatest fears, persevere, trust your inner wisdom, and let go of what is not for your highest good. These are just some key points to remember. I just want to quickly go back to remembering if you're going through a Saturn transit, a life transit, developmental transit, Saturn return, this is going to be very important for you at this key point, because Saturn-Pluto conjunction is going to be on your Saturn. So it really adds to that transit. Similarly, if you're going through Pluto square Pluto. So just keep in mind that those are particularly important. And I was going to show these charts, but I think we're running out of time. You can look at them yourself. They're very, very interesting. The chart of the award for Bradley Cooper, and at the time of the Grammy Awards, notice that Pluto was starting to go onto his Mercury, just to say that they don't always have to be awful, these transits, that he actually won a Grammy Award at the time. Now, it's also aspecting his moon, and I gather that he is split up from his partner, so there's also emotional stuff going on. And also for Lady Gaga, here is the Saturn, and it will be the Saturn-Pluto aspecting for Venus, which again is about her sense of identity. So again, a success, but also some issues maybe in her personal life. So let's not always assume that everything has to be doom and gloom with these transits. They are challenging, but there can also be an enormous sense of empowerment and really finding one's authentic self, one's authentic passion in life, if we navigate them in a conscious manner. So that's it.
Thank you, Margaret. And I think that is an important point. The Pluto-Saturn is about power, ultimately, and the use of power. So we will, I don't think we will be able to avoid the destructive aspect of the corruption that is going to emerge. But we can also see ourselves going through processes of empowerment. And I'm just reminded of that. I posted a chart again on the Facebook page of OPA about this young Kardashian who became a billionaire at age 19. And this was activated during Pluto on her ascendant, squaring her Saturn in Aries. So it's such a powerful force, and it could get out of hand. It could be difficult to harness, but it also could transform things in a constructive way.
Yes, I think it's all about facing our fears and trusting, ourselves and our inner selves, and working with it. That if we work with it in a conscious way to the best of our ability, then there's that very strong possibility for self-empowerment, which is really what the transit is pushing us towards.
All right, then we'll cheer to that, and for peace and for restoration, so that Capricorn can actually bring a sense of grounding and leadership to this world. thank you so much. And now we're moving away from Cancer Capricorn to some Neptunian Jupiterian energies that are happening simultaneously. So it's a very different climate, but it is nonetheless very much in our current reality. So I'm welcoming Kim Marie, an evolutionary astrologer living in South Dakota. Welcome, Kim.
Thank you, Maurice.
And Kim, you are the head of a school of astrology and having regular podcasts, so people can check your work on evolutionaryastrology.net. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I have got the menu right where it says start your PowerPoint slideshow. So trying to figure out how I get beyond that.
You can go to slideshow above and then
it's the menu is covering it. So I'm trying to get it to hide video panel. Nope, that's not it. It's right on top of it. So I'm going to see if I'm trying to figure out how, there, I got it. I got it. All right, here we go. There we go. All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, ladies, Maurice, Opa, and everybody who's out there listening. And Margaret, I have to point out our PowerPoint slides. I think we did very good coordinating together. You had the two fists, and I thought I would bring in the heart for Neptune and Jupiter. And so, first of all, just a little brief filter on where I come from. I have 7 of my 10 planetary archetypes in either Sagittarius or the 9th house, and I have a Sun, Mercury, Neptune conjunction within 1 degree. So I have a bit of Jupiter and Neptune in my chart. So Maurice, I guess you know what you're doing. So let me get all my paperwork off for you, and I see if my slides are now working for you.
I think it's the universe that made things happen. So the universe knows.
Yeah,
I'm just a blind operation.
Well, who wants a Neptune bubble bath escape through all this Capricornian energy, huh? Well, guess what? Jupiter and Neptune are not going to let us have it either. And hold on, I'm going to move this menu up so that it's not right in the middle of my screen here. They are in the midst of making what evolutionary astrology calls last quarter squares. And in EA, we always compare the faster moving planet to the slower. Start with the slower moving planet, wherever it is in your chart, counterclockwise to the faster moving planet. So here they are entering that last quarter square, and I'm going to have to click again. Just get me going. So here's the dates, all right? The dates of their last conjunctions that happened in 09 in Aquarius, the 3 last quarter squares they're making to each other, then when they go into that balsamic phase before they have their next conjunction in 2022 in 24 degrees Pisces. And so we'll work with some of these dates here over the next few minutes, but I want to go back to the cycle of phases and aspects and just kind of ground any new beginners real quickly. You know, Dane Rudier was the first one who popularized this, and these 8 phases are kind of based upon the terms that we give the sun, moon in their lunation cycle together. And so just in general, looking at the last quarter phase and, well, we can bring this in, conjunctions, oppositions, squares, semi-squares, sesquisquadrates, all of those marks that change one of the 8 phases. We can either have uniform evolution or cataclysmic. Uniform, step-by-step, slow growth. The baby becomes the toddler, learns to walk, grows up, etc. Cataclysmic evolution is when pressure and energy builds up and all of a sudden there's the volcano or the earthquake or the major life-changing event. And that typically happens when there's resistance to something. And so what I want to point out here for us today is that on an individual basis, when we have awareness of these transits and aspects to our chart that come up for us, it gives us that opportunity to make the changes proactively and work with whatever the archetypical intent of any planet or planets may be in the sky to our chart. What happens though on a collective level is many times consensus society has all that resistance to change. So they have a reaction to these planetary transits, and you usually will see the collective making the change after the transits. We look forward to the Uranus-Pluto squares and what's happening? And sometimes it's after those squares that we really see society catch up with everything. And so what's ultimately going on here is, again, there's that resistance to change, and eventually evolution is going to take place one way or another. Cataclysmic overrides uniform. Now, I just want to say, in regards to the intent of any archetype, the 12 archetypes of the zodiac, the aspects, etc., we're not always guaranteed that they will be naturally expressed. Just look around you at the patriarchal distortions that we have going on the planet. Sometimes things can be distorted as well. So, crises in consciousness or beliefs, that phase and specifically that last quarter square, 3/4 of the way around the circle. It's the totality of all the manifestations between any two planets since their last conjunction. And what we come up to with that crisis in consciousness is, I've done everything. I've accomplished it, hopefully. What next? And so it's like, been there, done that. Where's the meaning? And sometimes there will be disappointment, disillusionment when it doesn't mean anything anymore, or it didn't turn out the way we wanted it to. And then as we move into that last quarter of the circle, that's the surrender back to energy, back to source. This is where we have to recognize the greater powers in the universe, and do we work with them? This is where all the unfinished karma will show up, or any dharma that we are meant to do, and we have to surrender to that and work co-creatively with it, or we get forced to. Now, what I want to point out here is nothing is fated good or bad. It's really all about reaping what we sow, and what intent have we put into any two planets' relationship as they've worked 3/4 of the way around the circle. So that last quarter square and the last quarter phase, on a personal level, on a collective level, can bring about crises over anything and everything that any two planets together represent. It is the crisis in what we believe about Mercury, Jupiter, how we consciously express our beliefs and communicate what we intuitively know. It's a crisis around beliefs between any two planets. This is before we get to Jupiter and Neptune. And so I did not put this PowerPoint slide together with the beginner's stuff because of the time constraints. So I hit right to the point with Jupiter and Neptune. What is truth? Jupiter, more or less conscious beliefs, right brain intuition. Neptune, those deepest unconscious beliefs we hold. So when they start to go, what's it all mean? What do I believe? What is truth? There's this concept in evolutionary astrology called universal truth. And those are those timeless spiritual principles that have always existed and that always will, regardless of how we may suppress or distort them. In EA, we typically say they are, in essence, giving, sharing, and including. We survive better together on planet Earth. Versus the patriarchal distortions that we see all around us everywhere, taking, hoarding, and excluding. And if we're looking for these natural spiritual principles or natural law, universal truth, it can always be observed out in nature, and it can be understood through nature. The walk on the beach, just getting yourself outdoors and observing how the natural world works. And it's not always pretty. Things happen. Evolution takes place. There's also, though, this concept of personal truth. And so all of us individually on planet Earth, and all of us as cultures and religious belief systems, interpret that universal truth according to what we think it is, and then we project it out there into the world as my truth is the ultimate truth, and you have to all agree with me. Well, that's not working out too good for us, is it? And so the Jupiter last quarter squares to Neptune are really going to challenge our belief systems now and through the rest of their cycle together over the next few years. It's going to challenge our belief systems on the broadest levels possible. What is truth and what do I believe? Now, let me just briefly show you the most flamboyant example that we have right now. Love them or hate them. Nowhere are we seeing the truth versus lies complex more thrown out there than in Donald Trump's chart. Thank you, U.S. listeners, for my or international listeners for my U.S. perspective. These Jupiter, Neptune, last quarter squares, and then their individual transits, as you see on your lower left screen here, are going to be going through his chart for a few years, regardless of how 2019 goes or how the 2020 election takes place. They are going to be having the Donald reap what he has sown since 2009. And remember the birther movement with Obama when he was elected, reaping what he has sown in this entire lifetime when you look at the Gemini Sag opposition and that lunar eclipse he was born under. I won't go any further with this. I just have to point out how active. Go ahead, Maurice.
Kim, I have an important question. I mean, since you're bringing the Donald on board, the original conjunction of Jupiter, Neptune in 2009 was at 26 Aquarius, exactly opposing his Mars. So if you're saying there's kind of an echo to that original seeding point, what do you know? Anything that happened in his life around that time? Is there any records?
The biggest thing that I know, I didn't research that far back in regards to him. I've been more into the eclipses and Donald Trump, but that's when he really started in the birther movement on Barack Obama when he was elected president, and really gained a lot of his following, basically those who were perhaps opposed to a black president in the United States. That's when he really took off on that birther movement and said Obama's birth chart's not real, and he gained a following. That's how he really broke through it. Before then, he was known as the entertainer and the flamboyant rich real estate guy, raising money, losing money.
Interesting, because Jupiter, Neptune, and ideologies, and like you say, truth and lies. So he brought this controversy to light, and leading to the elections and to the whole concept, the debate. I mean, regardless of what side and who you voted for, there is a debate about fake news and about misinformation, which is part of this Jupiter, Neptune.
If you look at the U.S. chart for 1776, regardless of which chart, you see that Sun in Cancer square Saturn in Libra. The history of our country has been a debate about, do we include or exclude? And we've seen waves of it back and forth, from what we did to Native Americans to all the Europeans coming over to now, we're not going to let any more immigrants in. If you're European or Caucasian, you're the native. And it, for those of us who have a broader based perspective on something, it's like, isn't it a little hypocritical? And I live in the middle of Native American territory. So, I was kind of raised with, that's a joke. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So moving on back to that initial conjunction between Jupiter and Neptune, there were 3 of them, 24 to 27 degrees Aquarius. Quantum physics became a buzzword. Energy flows where attention goes. E equals MC squared. You can't destroy energy, you just change its form. And so we started to recognize if we change our thoughts and our focus, we can change what we manifest in our world. And that brings us to a real important concept with Jupiter and Neptune. Beliefs are conditioned thoughts. And so just look at how entrenched it can become with any formalization of a belief system, i.e. religions. For instance, the Catholic Church. The male priest cannot engage in sexuality, distorting natural law. Look how that's turned out. Look how that's been in their face this last quarter square, or the second half, or even, the whole cycle of this Jupiter-Neptune. So here's questions you can ask yourself. How can we detach from and objectify our most cherished beliefs? My husband of 25 years is divorcing me, and I believed he would love me forever. How do we cling, or where do we cling to that elitism that I'm right and you're wrong in regards to those personal truths and how different they are on planet Earth? Where can we find the common ground? And then what are the broadest levels of universal truth that you can understand? And so here's what I've kind of gotten known for with Neptune and Pisces. If I've said this once, I've said it a gazillion times. All we have to do is ask inwardly, outwardly. If you want to do like Nadiya said with Mercury, actually say this: what would you have me know, source? Followed by Mars, what would you have me do, source? Because when we ask questions, it invites an answer. And we can ask these questions directly of universal source. And then it broadens our understanding of our world, of the world out there. And it moves us like the ripple expanding out in the pond when you drop the pebble, of getting closer and closer to consciously Jupiter, knowing universal truth. And Maurice, I thought about this when you said that your next OPA is going to look at this concept of why does religion hate astrology? I have a joke. Astrology is the closest thing we have to an owner's manual. It's our direct connection to source. And when astrology, if it accepts, or when it accepts, or religion, when it accepts astrology, it takes out the external authority. And all of religion is based upon that God is outside of us. And so there lies that fulcrum between religion and astrology. Astrology, especially evolutionary astrology, we accept that there's a big kahuna or a cosmic intelligence out there, but religion cannot. And these Jupiter last quarter squares are bringing this all up, that it's just, witness the decline of Christianity and churches closing because no one is going to church on a regular basis anymore in the United States in the last decade or so. So go ahead.
It's interesting. We also have our Bible.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And it contains 60% of the original books. And yeah. And astrology and reincarnation were taken out of the Bible at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. You can go research that as a fact, knowledge-based beliefs. And
so it's interesting, you're mentioning religion going through crisis because of the pedophile scandals and younger generation, looking for different things. And at the same time, perhaps part of this Jupiter Neptune, there's a reclaiming of the far right, who's really trying to, feels lost perhaps, and needs to reclaim its identity. Is that part of the cycle, would you say?
Yeah. Oh, totally. Because if you look at religion, it's more Saturnian based with all that, crystallization of the book and the building and, these rituals and taboos. And Saturn Capricorn is just dissolving it as much as Jupiter Neptune is. And so when consensus feels lost, it just tries to hold on to that crystallization as it's just crumbling under its fingers, or as Neptune, just dissolving it into nothingness, which really feels insecure. This is why I say we've got to go inward, and we've got to have that deep inner connection with Source. I'm a walking cliche with all this Sag ninth, and I tell people all the time, the relationship you have with Universal Source is identical to the relationship you have with yourself, and vice versa. We only know Source out there to the degree we know it in here. And that's why we can just go inward and ask, what would you have me know? What would you have me do? And that's how we can move towards this inner peace through the chaos in the last half of this decade, not to mention all the unsettledness of the new beginnings as we move into the next decade. And then also with each of us on a personal basis with these Jupiter, Neptune last quarter squares, maybe it's not turning out in our world right now like we wanted it to. And there's certain karmic actions we're going to be required to take one way or another. My parents are moving to the same city I live in that I have been 4 hours away from for 35 years. Ooh, okay, Source. I have to now learn how to be responsible and the parent with my parent, even though I might want a little more freedom. Pluto, Saturn over my ascendant. And yet I've got this Jupiter last quarter square Neptune, and it's like, what's my karmic responsibilities with my parents, the ones who took care of me for so many years? Doesn't have to be bad or ugly, but there are sometimes going to be things that we're just going to become aware of. This is what I need to do for my soul's journey on planet Earth. And if we make peace with that, I will, my will, divine will, then we literally can become beacons of light through this Capricorn death and rebirth, through this chaos of what's changing in our world right now with everything going on. Let me give you another example. Mackenzie Bezos, she's been in the news recently. She's the third richest female in the world right now because transiting Jupiter in her 8th house, her husband, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, was exposed for adultery, and so she divorced him. She got $35 billion in April, and just last month she announced that she was signing the Giving Pledge, which was started by Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, in which she is pledging to give away most of her wealth. I'm not going to get into the debate right now, Jupiter last quarter square Neptune, of not taking the wealthy's money for nonprofits because of how they created that money. That's another subject that we could talk about for a while. But I just wanted to point out here, here's a positive example in an extreme of wealth, because right now, transiting Uranus is literally 5 degrees Taurus, sitting right there on her Venus and Moon in the 1st house. This is a woman who could have said, it's mine, and she pledged to give most of it away. Let's watch how she does that as Jupiter moves closer and closer and closer to Neptune, and they have their conjunction 2022 at, again, right on the cusp of her 12th house. Stay tuned. We'll all watch it happen together. I wanted to just quickly... Go ahead.
And opposing her Pluto.
Yeah. And opposing Pluto as well. So I want to quickly give you 2 collective examples that you wouldn't think of with Jupiter, Neptune. However, I think they're very germane to the subject, not just the Capricorn complex, okay? This is a book that I'm in process of reading. It's not the easiest book to read because this gentleman is a professor who spent 30 years studying economics, and his specialty was researching the history of debt. And this is his brand new book. And his whole thesis in this book is that pharaohs and kings, when their reign started, would always have a debt jubilee and wipe out the debts of the poor and those who would work the land. They would not wipe out the debts of the landholders or the merchants, but the masses, they would wipe out their debts so that they would create stability in their new reign, and it would last as long as it could. So throughout history, there has been continual resets of wealth inequality. It's nothing new. It's always been there. It will happen again one way or another. And so just a little snapshot for you with a quote from him in which he felt that Jesus, or the Bible, was always consumed with debt, not sin. I invite you to read this book if you want. Again, it's not a real easy book. It's full of the facts to back up the thoughts and opinions that he gives. Here's a book that's really easy to read. It just came out. This has been 4 female speakers today. Thank you very much, OPA. This woman is my heroine. She has been writing about money and banking as a public utility forever. And I have been reading her work for, oh gosh, ever since Pluto went into Capricorn. I said, I better educate myself. And so she just came out with this book. If you listen to this podcast, I strongly recommend you get this. I don't care where on planet Earth you live. If you want to have food, clothing, and shelter, if you want truth, if you want everyone on planet Earth to be able to play in the same sandbox together, not all of us in, a penny for you and a penny for me, but to really have a fair opportunity for everybody, this is your book. This is her 3rd book. Skip the first 2. Just go to this one. She recaps everything and really gives us choices. I have been saying for a while that the public banking movement is going to take off in the United States, and it already has in various places around the country or around the planet. Germany is one example. India is another example. It's going to take off like the cannabis movement did in the United States. And so this is Jupiter last quarter square Neptune, really revealing the truth of how they have created interest to be the slave on our back for most of people. We can lend money with no interest, by the way, or with interest so low, or where the interest goes back to the public, city, state, province, country, and used to repurpose the building of all the infrastructure with Saturn. Well, with Jupiter, new phase to Saturn, both new phase to Capricorn, that's going to be coming. If you want hope through the fear and through all this crisis that's coming, this is it. So, climate change.
That's a very Jupiter, Neptune, a salvation solution.
Yeah. I one more little detail, if you don't mind me going a little over time. I live in western South Dakota, and our twin is North Dakota. Our states are Sun in Scorpios. We have Moon in Pisces. I was going to look up their charts, and I forgot getting ready. But North Dakota in 1919 created the Bank of North Dakota, and 750,000 people are sitting on $4 billion of cash in that state. Their return, all the state assets and income, it doesn't go to Wall Street, it stays on Main Street. Their mandate is 4 things: farmers and ranchers, student loans, home mortgages, and small businesses. Their state bank acts like a mini central bank to all the banks. There are more banks per capita in North Dakota than any other state in the Union, 7 times as many. They've just celebrated 100 years of the Bank of North Dakota. For the last 15 years, it's had an 18% return on equity. South Dakota didn't go that way. There's 2 twin charts that shows you how different they can be.
Let me ask you, we often associate banking with Saturn, Pluto, and you bring it to Jupiter, Neptune. Like, how do you see this relates directly to? truth. So basically,
Truth.
it's more of a global exposure rather than
Yes.
specifically the economy of things.
Yes, yes. And my point is, I call it the Saturn complex. Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto are not going to be operating in isolation. I mean, Jupiter is going to be waning Neptune for the next 4 years through all of this, and it's going to have a say, even though it's not shouting from the rooftops.
Okay.
Sorry.
And, because I'm also thinking that the original conjunction was in 2009 when we had a bubble burst.
Yep.
And that's,
There you go.
bubbles and Jupiter and Neptune burst.
Yep. And in the United States, which is where most of that global crisis started, we didn't correct the banking infrastructure. We pretended to, Jupiter, Neptune. And so here are those seed thoughts coming home to roost over the last quarter. And here's the karma that's going to be exposed on a broad level. If you really study Ellen Brown's work, and her website is webofdebt.com, when they loan principal but don't loan the interest, it's unsustainable. And that's why in the ancient days, the pharaohs and the kings would eventually just have to clear out the debts because the system was structured to collapse. And the banks are trying to just keep that under the wraps. And thank you, digital age, Jupiter, Neptune conjunction in Aquarius.
Thank you so much.
I got one more. I want to give everybody we don't have to talk about climate change other than I want to show you this artist's rendition of the magnetic field of Jupiter. And here's Jupiter just spreading its word. And then the conjunction that happens in 2022, we are not going to let go of Pisces. So what's going to happen? How are these religions going to, evolve? How are we going to evolve with climate change? This is one of my favorite slides, so I want to leave you with this one. Violence is a method by which the ruthless few can subdue the passive many. Nonviolence is a means by which the active many can overcome the ruthless few. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Maurice. Thank you, OPA. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen who showed up.
Thank you. And I will remind everyone, speaking of Jupiter, that Jupiter is very close to the Earth these days in its opposition to the Sun in Gemini. And you can actually possibly see its moons if you have clear skies. And thank you truly for your wonderful presentation, because I think that's part of the important contribution of astrology. It is to help us understand the bigger picture and also help us prepare, make use of these energies. So we're not just going through the motions, we actually have a reference point. And so discussing these issues, some of them may be more intense than others. Having knowledge help us navigate things more constructively. And I think that's one of the great contributions of astrology. And you've all done such an incredible job, first of all, describing the energies, but also providing tools to transmute this into something that is useful, it's constructive, because astrology is part of nature. There's nothing good or bad, it's energy. How do you use that energy? Are you gonna crash and burn, or are you going to elevate it? So just a quick word also about what's coming up with OPA. On the 22nd, we have a free presentation by Chris McCrae on Jupiter Saturn cycle, followed by Alan Clay on the dwarf planet early July. And Chris McCrae is also going to be one of the track leaders at the OPA retreat next year. You can go to the OPA website, go to events, and then see retreat tracks, and you'll see the full details here of every track. And we're going to have our next OPA Live in the next equinox. So we're going to have details about that. So stay tuned, OPA. Thank you all for your contribution, and definitely check the retreat. You have a better price now. You know, this is going to be a highlight of 2020. Good. Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the weekend.
Thank you, Maurice.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
For all the love in the chat, for the amazing panelists, for Maurice and to OPA. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. It's been a delight. Thank you. Bye-bye, everyone.
Many blessings.